We are moving on to chapter 13, A Time of Study. Like I said, your favorite topic, Russia.
Yes.
And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how it all started for you. I mean, I read here at age of 53, you started learning the Russian language.
Yes. Well, yes, indeed. You know, I was so grateful for this because after several years of this awful depression, homeless, loveless, jobless, and alone, as I described it, I suddenly found myself with something to do and an occupation, and I soon, almost immediately, got absolutely so interested in this. And one of the nicest things I discovered was that the Russian textbooks I had were full of little traditional drawings, beautiful drawings of course, everything I loved: horses, cattle, little wooden houses, and all the features of traditional Russian life, which were really almost the only thing our mother had told us about as children, because she, being a refugee, or well, an unwilling refugee, to say the least, from the awful cataclysmic years of the Revolution and Civil War, she didn't tell us about any of that. So I grew up ignorant about it, with only the sweetness of Russia in my mind. And these early books that I had connected me with that. And so I fell in love with Russia completely, and that never left me. And as I got on to more serious topics than just the basic ABC of the language, this great issue of the head and the heart came to the fore, which I then realized, and I've been realizing ever more really throughout my life, is the absolute key to understanding much of what goes on in human affairs. And so I'm very glad of this opportunity just to elaborate a bit on that. For this head or heart issue is right at the very core of Russia and Russia's relationship with the West, with where most of us come from. And it really, a key component of this is the Russian forest, where the Russian nation really formed. It's hard to grasp the scale of the forest, but I believe I'm right in saying that if a squirrel climbed into a tree in Poland, it could travel all the way to the Pacific coast opposite Japan without touching the ground, jumping from tree to tree. It's a continuous belt of forest that encircles, I don't know if it's quite half the globe, but not far off it. And although the southern part of Russia is the steppe, which is comparable to the American prairie, the American Western prairie, the main Russian character is taken from the forest. Now, then, how do people live in a forest? Go back to before the days of technology and airplane. The one basic tool they had in their hands was an axe. Now, there you are alone in the dark forest with the wolves and the winter. The first thing you do is build a little shelter, isn't it? With only an axe. And Russians are masters at building little wooden houses with an axe. And I watched them doing this. And it's quite true that the only tool needed to build yourself a little wooden house is an axe. This is why Russians' houses are all of this standard size, the size of a tree trunk. If they can't be any bigger, First of all, you notch 4 tree trunks into each other in a rectangle. Then you cut another 4 and put them on top, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one, another one, until you reach up to high enough. And then you put a roof on top of that, and you cut out a door and a window or 2 if you want it. And then that's your house. Then you put up a few rails and curtains inside, no other walls, and build a stove out of clay in the middle, and there's your home. And the other people, if they're any near around you, build their houses in the same way. And this little wooden house is you could almost say is the Russian character, surrounded by endless miles of forest, and God knows how far from the next little gathering of houses in the next village, and cut off from almost everything else, at least for 6 months of the year in the deep snow. So this sort of insular, defensive isolation is very Russian. And even today, by far the most favorite theme on Christmas cards and birthday cards and sort of calendars and all the little things that people give each other is this little wooden house. They love it. It's home to them. Now, you see, it's that defensive, protective home. So Russia is not essentially an aggressive nation. It's a defensive nation. How can you go out? You can't. You haven't. There are no roads. You can't use wheels. In winter, you could use a sledge. If you're lucky, you've got a horse to pull the sledge. It's like that, and somehow other countries like England, for example, whose civilization has grown out of seafaring, this exploration, this outward sort of outwardness in the character, as for most European nations, have had this outward going. And the other great thing that has come in to form the Russian character is its religion. Now, Orthodoxy likes to consider itself the original version of Christianity. Now, that'll rouse a bit of opposition, no doubt, in a lot of people. But if you just go back in history to the time when the early center of the Christian church was in Constantinople, and then Rome sort of became another center. And the church has really developed since those days into 2 branches, Eastern Orthodoxy, which was centered on Constantinople, and the Western teachings of Rome. Now, the Roman church there's a clause in the Bible where it talks of the Spirit coming from the Father. And I think it's a little bit further on, it's a bit ambiguous how people interpret this. The Spirit coming from the Father, or the Father and the Son. Now, if you understand the Spirit as coming from the Father, that's one thing. If you understand the Spirit coming from the Father and the Son, you see the Son is representing man. So man becomes a key component of God's interaction with the world through man. Now, the Orthodoxy doesn't look at it in quite the same way. In Orthodoxy, man is not exactly bypassed, but he's understood as the one that strayed away from heaven, who fell into what the church calls sin, who took a wrong turning, as it were. Go back to the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They were tempted and they fell. And see, for that they were expelled from paradise, and the wages of sin is death. This is why man dies, because he's left spirit. And another very key verse says, "Cursed is the land for your sake." So that this error in man of leaving the spirit and falling in consciousness to a lower level of life, into mortality, in other words, is transmitted by infection, just like a virus is transmitted. And so the whole world dies. So nature itself dies. So the animals die. This is how orthodoxy looks at it, you see. So man is really the cause of the problem. And so this is what labels man as a sinner. So orthodoxy is very much, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now in the West, man is not seen in the same way. Man is put on, given a higher estate or more favorable estate. And the whole history of Western art and development is based on this outwardness of the glorification of man that these days has filtered down to the emphasis on human rights, the emphasis on the respect for the individual. The individual matters. The individual is all important. Self-realization, self this, self that. Everything is self these days, isn't it? In other words, it's up to me. What, being true to yourself is every child is brought up to think this is me, my time, I matter. Now in Russia, it's not like this at all. The individual is not given this emphasis in Russia. It's rather suppressed, or if not suppressed, at least it's not given attention, so it doesn't develop in the same way. And this, by the way, is see, the West, this is what's ego, is egoism, because this is me is the ego, which makes us separate not only from God, but from each other. Whereas in Russia, this egoism is notably, I won't say absent, but very, very much less. It's not primarily an egoistic society. It's a society that looks to higher authority. No, it's a highly complicated topic. I'm not going to be able to summarize this up in a few minutes like this, but all these aspects of it suddenly sort of flooded into my receptive mind at the age of 53, and suddenly I began to understand. I began to understand why I felt different from so many other people, and I was sort of I just couldn't fit within the general thinking pattern of those of the Western world around me. And I suddenly thought, oh, this is where I come from. This explains it. This is why it is. And as I said, in the late 1600s, there was this Tsar, the ruler of Russia, who turned to the West. He actually came to Europe and worked in England for a while to study Western culture, and said, this is the way we must go. Russia was primitive. Russians were still living in their little wooden houses and would be there till kingdom come unless I did something about it. So he tried to drag Russia into the modern world. And of course, a lot of people followed him and became known as Westernizers. And the people that resisted and said this is contrary to the Russian soul are the Slavophiles. And in other words, those that held to the traditional Slav culture, this Slav forest dwellers, this little wooden hut in the forest. Sorry. Have you been able to follow me? I hope so. It's all a bit complicated. I'm not sure I've explained it very well, but head versus the heart. My goodness me, that is an important factor. And anyone that tries to understand Russia, particularly vis-a-vis the West, needs to take this one on board. Otherwise, you'll just get upset because the Russians aren't like the West, and the West isn't like Russia. And this leads to a lot of misunderstanding all the way down the line. Russians don't believe in man-made laws. See, they turn to higher authority. They turn to God at its best, and then because it's difficult to relate to God, you tend to put a tsar, an overall, man in charge, a sort of figurehead of a man, a sort of king, and then you see it makes them an easy prey to well, if you get a good ruler, it's very good, but of course they're often not very good, so you get a bad one. But they tend to be you can rather unkindly say they're a nation of slaves, but it's not. It's a bit unkind, not quite true. They're not me. They'll easily give the authority to a higher authority. They're not sort of self-assertive in this way. So when communism arrived 100 years ago, which was incidentally a product of Western intellectualism, they became an easy prey to it and got drawn into it with all the problems that most of you probably have some idea. In some ways, it was very good. It did a lot of good things. It raised up the general sort of modernizing, if you think that's a virtue of Russia. In other ways, it didn't destroy, it did its best to destroy the Russian soul, but of course you can't do that. It certainly didn't emphasize it, and that's why, to some extent, since the demise of communism, this Russian soul has burst out afresh in the amazing resurrection of the Russian Church and the essence of what it is to be Russian.
You also write that you learned to really appreciate more deeply the responsibility of what the School of Meditation called work in the wider human field as you were connecting it to your experience to Russia. Can you elaborate on that? And maybe also elaborate what you mean by when you say the work?
Yes, this phrase was used by the School of Meditation in relation to the practice of meditation. Those who start to meditate soon find see, one of the things you've got to do is practice meditation, which means sitting down twice a day and practicing it. Now, many people in the West are busy, and the most common reason why people don't continue meditation is because they are busy. And the demands of the world, I must do this, that, and the other, all too easily squeeze out the practice of meditation, where you just sit down and apparently, in the eyes of the world, do nothing. You just let go, which is rather contrary to the way we're brought up to live in the West, which is I must get on, I must do this and get that and that, control things. So the world, so in this alternative, you see, those that are sincere and genuinely want the fruits of meditation, you need to work. You need to put it first, the work. Now, as I began to study Russia, I'll go back a bit. Now, this work of meditation, it may not start this way, but it develops into really work with the heart, because it's beyond the thinking process. You can't think your way to meditation, although to begin with, people can't stop thinking, but you learn to deal with this as you advance in practice. And Russia's another word for meditation is prayer of the heart. It's not prayer in the intellectual process. It's prayer of the heart. Now, this is another, I won't try to explain that too much now. And this heart will find itself in some, in contrast to the action of the world. And most people in the world sort of equate action as something admirable. What are you doing is one of the first questions of life, isn't it? What's your occupation? Oh, I'm a this and a that. I do this. And oh, that's great. We say, oh, dear, I must do that. And it gives you a good income. Yes, etc. All of this sort of thing. This is the world. And meditation is the opposite, you see. Meditation is letting go of all that and discovering, as I've often demonstrated to you, this infinite beyond. The spirit. This is the world, you see, which is largely governed by the intellect. And this is the emotion, this is the yearning of the heart, the mystic yearning in every heart for the inexplicable. Now then, as I began to understand more about this head or the heart and the character of not only individuals, but of nations. The penny began to drop. I began to think, now then, makes sense. You see, this drama is enacted not only inside ourselves, but in the whole world, isn't it? So incidentally, I've told you in our last interview how I struggled with this awful depression, you see, until really now. And of course, depression is always, this is one of the factors of depression. It's me, isn't it? It's all based on me. Whereas when I began to open up now and to see this drama in the whole world, so it helped, it pulled me out of my own depression into a wider field.
I'm glad you shared that, John, because I think we all can relate to, I don't have time today.
Yes, I did. No, it's absolutely all standard in the West. I can't tell you how many people I've known that started off on this work full of enthusiasm, good intention, and just got pulled away, gobbled up by the monsters of this world. Of course, we don't think of them as monsters. We call them good works or being useful, playing my part in the world. Well, in a sense, we are maintaining the structures of the world, the structures of egoism, of this ego-dominated world. And so we're left with this sort of vague feeling of emptiness, of pointlessness. What's it for? Well, if we're all going to die anyway. And the world is dying around us, isn't it? Mostly everybody's got the message now that man is the cause of this destruction of nature. It's taken a long time to sink in. Wise people have known this for centuries. The modern world's just about beginning to catch up now. But it's true. The wages of sin is death. This is why the world is well, a lot of people will say it is dying. Who's the fault? My fault. So, because we've abandoned, you see, our true place, our little hut in the forest where we were integrated and led a natural life, where me hardly came into it. It was all the family living together, almost like a family of animals living together in this one little room in the forest, dependent on each other. So the families being split up and all going off and living in different houses and not even looking after their old people in old age. Extraordinary, isn't it? This is absolutely unthinkable to a Russian, that old people should be living in, not looked after by their family. Every Russian son automatically will look after his old father. It's just expected. This is the way that the society works. and you see, this is really the reason, you see, for this tension between East and West. It's a different, there's a, before it ever breaks out into physical warfare, see, it's a cultural invasion, a fear of this Western way of life being imposed on the Russian. And of course, the West sees this. You see, the West feels this is their mission to civilize the Russian, you see, according to their standards. In other words, impose the culture of egoism on this nation where egoism is basically not admired, is not wanted, is not considered important. And so, of course, the Russian is often compared to a bear. You can bait the bear up to a certain point. But in the Middle Ages, they used to bear bait, didn't they? Tease the poor creature until he just got maddened and it would break out into violence, which is what happens. So there we are, head versus the heart. It has deep roots, deep roots. Explains a lot of what goes on in the world. So there we are, back to a time of study. All this was beginning to come together in my mind, and I was thrilled to bits to really pursue this, and to be given the time and space to do so. And I read great works of Russian literature and some of the Russian philosophers, and studied the history, and it all began to fall into place. I understood little by little so much more, and understood this dichotomy in my own character. And then, yes, and all this fitted in with what the School of Meditation called the work, which was this practice of meditation that led attention away from the intellect, from the linear intellect, the progress from the development from the past to the future, you see, into the perfection of the present now. The kingdom of God within us, see, not dependent on the works of man at all.
John, on page 120, you write, if you are of a mind that distrusts complexity, yes, and suspects that many words seldom bear much truth. And I've heard you talk about this before, distrusting complexity, but yes, then you talk about the work of Pushkin and some of these other Russian authors.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I love that. My goodness, it's true, isn't it? And yes, Pushkin was like the sort of Shakespeare of Russia. That's interesting enough. He was a black man, or half black, I think. It must have been in the very early days of somehow or other into the Russian court. A black boy, a black child. Well, probably by that time, he was a black man appeared, and gosh, I suppose, and must have fathered a son, and that son was this poetic genius called Pushkin, who was really the father figure of Russian literature, and his poetry is. It not only is it all of it is. He did write a few stories, but his poetry, by which he's best known, is all in beautiful rhyming. Is it hexameters? La di da di da di da, la di da di da di da. Beautiful rhythm, and so simple, my dears. It's unbelievably beautifully simple. Children can understand it. And somehow he describes the sweet, simple. Yes, it's absolutely quite untranslatable into the West, into English. But every child knows about Pushkin and can quote from Pushkin. Yes.
the sentence, if you are of a mind that distrusts complexity.
Yes.
What is it about complexity and being a spiritual student?
Well, you see, that's easy to explain. The spirit is always present now, whereas the world is divided in, first of all, the past and then the future, you see. If you think of the cross, look, you see that cross hanging behind me on the door. Where is it? That side, isn't it? There we are. There, behind the door. Now you see there's a horizontal arm like that. Now this is, you see, from past to future. The world goes like a great wheel going round and round and round from yesterday to tomorrow. You see, so the world tends to live in this dimension. Get it better tomorrow. Living for tomorrow, the future. Now the other dimension is the perpendicular. You see. Now the perpendicular doesn't go anywhere, or it doesn't go there or there. It's always now. It's perpendicular, isn't it? It rises from this to that, from matter to spirit. So here you have these two dimensions. The West tends to live in this world, getting things right. The spirit is always now. Now, be present. Being present now, we discover what it means to be in the presence of God. We come to peace, because the presence is still, isn't it? It's silent, it's peace, and it's complete. You have no problems, because problems are always to do with the future. How do we cope with the future? The present is always now. And this is really what the Spirit's all about. The kingdom of God is with us. God is with us. Now, the fait accompli. It's not tomorrow.
So simple.
What we need, we've got. What we need to discover it, you see. We need to come out of this prison with our end always looking this way or that way. Discover this. How is it done? Of course, the mind is always thinking in this linear way. You just watch your thoughts all the time. They're either regretting the past, miserable about the past, or worrying about the future. Who's going to look after me when I die? This sort of thing. Where am I going to find this perfect man or woman?
John, are you speaking from experience?
I have, dear. I've lived this way most of my life too. It's only now I'm wise and I've given up the struggle. There's some young people staying now and coming to meditate with me, and one of them was a girl from Lithuania who she was here a few weeks ago, and she said, I came here thinking I knew everything, and now I realize I don't know anything. Bless her heart. That's exactly right, you see. I like the way people call me Mr. Nothing or Mr. Empty, you see, because I'm nothing. I can't say anything. I'm just silent. I don't talk as little as possible. And so sort of all our sort of clever knowledge, at least rather fizzles out in my presence, you see. And that doesn't seem perhaps quite as real as the still silence and just feet on the ground. Listen and look, listen to it's getting the first days of spring now. The little birds are beginning to twitter. First snowdrops are appearing. And these, you see, bring us out of all this complexity in the world, trying to understand what life's all about. God knows what life's about. I don't know. And but it's in not knowing that we discover the real wisdom, which is the real knowledge, which is God knows that I do not. Now you try to say that to a clever Western politician or any Western leader or almost anybody in the West. I know, you see, they all think they know, all think they know what life's about and what's right and what's wrong. What to do about not only the world, but their neighbor and everybody else, and the Russians, incidentally. and so this is what we call the world. And the work, you see, is to offer this alternative, which is let all that go and discover the perfection. And I mean perfection, seriously. Well, it takes a while to discover it, but when you discover it, you discover this is the true oversight of the world.
You write, the 5 years of study bring me closer to God, ? And then you say, I cannot really say it brought me close to Russia and helped to steady me after the rather wild emotions of my recent years. Mm-hmm. Then you go on, it certainly was a contrast to my time in the desert. Sounds like you're discovering your appreciation for life and love and people.
I don't say it was much exactly appreciation, but I was very clearly instructed in the early days of meditation that people always start to meditate for themselves. What's in it for me? What do you want? You see, this is, of course, how we start. But there's a second aspect to meditation, which is with and for others. You begin to see that not only am I in difficulties, but the world is in difficulties. How do I help myself? How can I help the world? How can I serve the world? And this is what these studies did for me. They opened up the work in service to the world. It doesn't mean to say you love the world. You appreciate that other people are in the same mess. And if you found something helpful to yourself, this is a way of service. Your own ego world expands to some extent. Up to now, my expansion had been largely towards nature. I'd rather turned away from. I always felt I was no good at society. I was shy. I never knew what to say. I felt I didn't really belong in the human world. So I preferred the company of animals and nature. But gradually I lost that and began to feel more comfortable, particularly among the Russian people who I thought as I did. I found it easy to be close to them. Yeah. Did it help me to be nearer God? Well, God knows, dear. I don't know if I am now. I don't know. I remember being told that a feature of the wisest people is that they consider themselves the worst of sinners. I think that applies very much. I've never been more aware of my own failures, my own shortcomings, my own distance from God, really. Maybe some people think I am close, but personally, I think it's more healthy for us to be more aware of our sins. It's the essence of Russian faith, you see. Russian faith is really founded on monasticism. Russians love monasticism, which used to be fairly widespread in the West, but now it hardly exists. But this idea of abandoning the world, you see, for God is very deep in the Russian soul. And every monk it's obligatory to pray what's called the Jesus prayer, which is the Russian form of meditation. So this is very widely understood in Russia, this let go, let God. You see, this surrender to higher authority, this not this clinging on to the world, but the letting go of the world, you see, and submitting yourself to God. Thy will, not mine. Thy will be done. Well, that is best, you see. This is wonderful. This is pure spirituality. At its lower level, it leaves the Russian subject to exploitation, you see, the slave to clever devils who come in and steal the soul away.